$4,200 and a rifle leveled at a widow's cattle. That was the Tuesday morning that would cost Sullivan Creed every dollar, every deed, and every bought soul he'd spent 9 years stacking up. Because the hired gun swearing, he'd burn her dead husband's brand off every steer she owned. Had no idea the drifter, leaning against the fence post, hat low, saying nothing, had buried more men than the banker who'd sent him had ever signed mortgages. Her name was Ada, 26 years old, and she had buried a husband 11 months before, and very nearly buried herself in the debt he'd left stitched into the deed. The man who held that debt was Sullivan Creed, the richest man in Larkspur County, and he had decided her ranch, her herd, and her good name all belonged to him now, on paper, if not yet in fact. Stay till the end, partner, because before the leaves turned that year, Sullivan Creed would learn exactly what he'd bought when he sent a rifle to a gate where a famous gunslinger happened to be standing. If you want more of these, the quiet ones who ride in and never raise their voice until it matters, hit that subscribe button before we go on, and drop where you're watching from in the comments below. I like knowing how far a story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning of it, back before the rifle, before the note came due, back to the spring when the grass first came up green on the Whitlock Range, and nobody in Larkspur County had cause yet to say the name Gideon. The territory of New Mexico, 1881. Larkspur County sat in a bowl of hill country, where the grass grew good 7 months out of 12. And the other 5 you prayed. It was cattle country, the way some places are gold country, or timber country. The whole economy of it built on beef, on the hoof, and beef on the hoof built on credit, because no rancher in that country had cash sitting still. They borrowed against the spring calf crop to buy seed and wire and salt, borrowed against the fall gather to carry the herd through winter, and every one of those loans ran, sooner or later, through the only bank within 80 miles, the Larkspur County Trust, and every note the trust wrote carried the signature of the man who owned it, outright Sullivan Creed. Creed had come into that country 9 years before, with nothing but a law degree from back east and a talent honed sharp as a skinning knife for reading the fine print other men didn't bother with. He'd started small, buying up tax liens on land nobody thought was worth the trouble, and by the time Ada Whitlock's husband Thomas had ridden west to build a ranch of his own, Sullivan Creed held paper on more than half the spreads in the county and held the county commissioners and the town marshal in roughly the same grip he held his mortgages, quietly, legally, and completely. Thomas Whitlock had built his ranch, the Anchor W, out of nothing but grit and a small inheritance, 4,000 acres of good grass along Sweetwater Creek that he'd fenced and stocked and named for the Anchor brand his grandfather had run back in Missouri. He married Ada 2 years before he died, a quiet courthouse wedding with her sister, as the only witness, and in the 2 years they had together he taught her the ranch, the way a man teaches a partner. How to walk into the bank in Larkspur and ask a hard question and wait for the honest answer. It was that education that would matter more than either of them could have known, because Thomas Whitlock died in the spring of 1880, thrown from a green horse he was breaking in a corral he'd built with his own hands, his neck broken before Ada could reach him across the yard, and a mortgage note held by Sullivan Creed that came due, in full, on the 1st of October, 1881. That note had never been Ada's idea. Thomas had taken it out the year before he died, a modest loan against a bad drought year, $4,200, borrowed to carry the herd through a summer. His intention, plain enough in his own accounting, was to pay it down across 3 seasons, the way every rancher in that country financed a bad year, a little at fall gather, a little at spring branding, the debt shrinking the way debts were supposed to shrink when a man was alive to work it off. But the note Sullivan Creed had actually drawn up, the one Thomas signed in a hurry on a hot afternoon with cattle bawling in the pens outside and a banker's clerk hovering with more papers to push in front of him, did not match what Thomas believed he'd agreed to. There was no mention, anywhere a tired eye would naturally land, of 3 years of graduated payments. Buried 3 clauses deep in a paragraph dense with the kind of language lawyers write specifically so working men will skim past it, sat the true terms: full principal plus interest compounded quarterly, due whole and entire on the 1st of October, 1881, 18 months from signing. Not 3 years. A single balloon payment that no smallholding rancher in that county could ever hope to raise in cash. Thomas never caught it. He wasn't a lawyer, only a rancher trying to get back to his herd before dark, and he trusted, the way honest men new to a country learn not to, that the bank in town dealt fair with a man who paid his interest on time every month without fail. Sullivan Creed had built an entire fortune on exactly that kind of trust, and exactly that kind of note, quietly buried in language dense enough that a working rancher's eye slid right past the clause that would eventually cost him everything he'd built. In the 11 months since the funeral, Ada had run the Anchor W herself, and run it well, better than most men in the county gave a widow credit for. She rose before the sun the way Thomas had, rode the fence line twice a week, checking for slack wire and washouts, doctored screwworm in the cattle with her own hands the way he'd taught her, and kept the branding book current down to the last calf because she understood, in a way some ranchers never bothered to, that a book was the ranch's memory, and a memory kept sloppy was a memory. A man like Sullivan Creed could rewrite. She had buried her husband, and within a season learned to do the work of 2 people without ever once complaining to a neighbor about the size of the load. Because complaining, she'd decided early on, the county had watched her do it, and mostly approved, in the quiet, grudging way frontier country approved of anyone who simply kept working through grief instead of selling out and moving back east, and that approval, she would later understand, was itself a kind of currency Sullivan Creed had been counting on to run out before she ever thought to question the note in her husband's strongbox. Ada found that note 2 months after the funeral, read it 3 times at the kitchen table with a lamp burning past midnight, and understood, with a coldness that settled into her stomach and did not leave for the better part of a year, that she owed Sullivan Creed $4,200 plus interest in 5 months' time, and that she did not have it, could not raise it, and had no way on God's earth to sell enough cattle at a fair price fast enough to close the gap. She rode into Larkspur the next week to ask for terms. Creed received her in his office above the bank, a room with a good rug and a good desk, and a window that looked down Main Street like a man surveying land he already owned. And he was, in that first meeting, entirely, courteously, devastatingly reasonable. Sorry for her loss, first. Fond memories of Thomas, his grit, his standing as a credit to the county, second. A widow's position was difficult, he understood that, and the bank was not, whatever people liked to whisper about it, in the business of turning good people out of their homes. An extension might be possible. Even a full restructuring of terms, if she could demonstrate the ranch's continued viability, a fair, reasonable, businesslike thing to ask of any borrower, delivered in a voice pitched exactly halfway between sympathy and procedure. All the bank required to consider it properly was a look at her books, her herd count, her water rights filing, so the collateral could be assessed the way sound lending practice demanded. Ada had learned from Thomas to read a hard question honestly, and honesty was precisely the blind spot Sullivan Creed had built his whole career on exploiting, because she did not yet know to be afraid of a question that only sounded honest, and she opened her books to him the way a drowning woman grabs the hand held out to her, never once pausing to ask herself whose hand it actually was. It took her most of that summer to understand what she'd actually done. Creed's assessment of her collateral turned, county record by county record, into something else entirely. A quiet campaign conducted entirely within the letter of the law to strip every asset she owned down to its studs before the note ever came due, so that whatever was left of the Anchor W by October would already belong to the bank in every way that mattered, note or no note. The first blow landed on the water. Sweetwater Creek ran through both the Whitlock Range and the neighboring Dunmore spread, and the two families had shared it for 20 years on nothing more than a handshake and a filing, so old Thomas had barely thought to mention it. That summer, the arrangement got challenged in the county land office on a technicality buried in a revision to territorial water law that Creed's own lawyer had helped draft 2 legislative sessions back, written broad enough that almost any old handshake filing in the county could be picked apart by whoever thought to look. The challenge went through inside 3 weeks, uncontested, because neither family knew to contest it until the ruling was already final, and it cut Ada's irrigated acreage by a full third, land that had grown good hay every summer of her marriage, now lying dry because a lawyer in a courthouse 2 counties over had decided on paper that it should. The second blow landed on the grass itself. The open grazing lease on county land bordering the Anchor W, 6 years in Thomas's name without so much as a late fee, came up for its ordinary renewal that August, and Ada assumed, because no one had ever told her otherwise, it was not. The lease went instead to a new outfit nobody in the county had heard of before that spring, underbidding nothing, simply awarded on a closed process Ada was never informed was even open, and it took her 3 more weeks of asking around before a clerk who owed her nothing but plain decency admitted, quietly, that the new outfit's entire operating capital traced back to a single loan from the Larkspur County Trust. The third blow landed on her market. Pruitt, her cattle buyer of 4 years, an honest man who'd bought Whitlock beef since before she'd married into the name, simply stopped answering her letters that July. She rode the 40 miles to his yard herself to ask why, and he could not meet her eyes across his own porch rail when he finally gave her the answer. The trust held the note on his slaughterhouse contract, too, it turned out, and had made plain in the particular unspoken way banks make things plain to men who owe them money. That continuing to deal with the Anchor W would not serve his interests going forward. He was sorry. He said so twice. It changed nothing about the letters he stopped sending. None of it was illegal. That was the particular cruelty of Sullivan Creed's method, the thing that made him more dangerous than any outlaw with a gun. A gun could be answered with a gun, but a mortgage clause could only be answered with a lawyer Ada could not afford, filed in a land office Creed's money had built. Argued before a judge who rode circuit through Larkspur twice a year, and stayed, each time, as C. Ade's guest at the best hotel in town. By the time the leaves started turning that September, Ada Whitlock had a herd worth perhaps $3,000. At a fair market she could no longer reach, a water right cut by a third, a grazing lease stolen out from under her by her own creditor. Dawned the 1st of October, with absolutely no honest way left to pay it. She had one card left to play, and she played it the second week of September, riding into town to ask Criad directly, face to face, whether any arrangement at all, a longer term, a partial payment set against future gathers, anything a reasonable creditor might accept. Sullivan Criad received her again in that same handsome office, and this time he did not bother with the courtesy of pretending. The note was the note. Business was business. And in point of fact, he already had a buyer lined up for the Anchor W's grass and water the moment the bank took possession. A buyer prepared to pay the trust considerably more than $4,200 for 4,000 acres of good creek bottom grazing with the competing water claims already cleared off the books. Thanks entirely to this summer's quiet legal work. He delivered all of it looking at her the way a man looks at a ledger column he expects to close favorably, unhurried, almost kind in his flatness, and then, because he was not a man who left anything to chance, came the last of it, men would be riding out to the Anchor W within the week to conduct what he called a formal inventory of the collateral. Her herd, her equipment, her land, ahead of the foreclosure filing. Ada rode home that afternoon with her jaw set and her eyes dry, because she had learned in the 11 months since Thomas died that crying changed nothing a bank ledger cared about, and she did not yet know that 4 days later a stranger would ride onto the Anchor W range. He came from the north, down out of the high country, where the aspens were already gone gold, riding a big rangy gray gelding that moved like it had covered real distance and meant to cover more. Not from want of company, but from some old habit of keeping their business to themselves. He stopped at the Anchor W gate not because he meant to stop, he'd tell her later, but because his gray had thrown a shoe on the rocky stretch above the creek crossing, and the nearest smith was in Larkspur 11 miles on. Ada found him there at midday, sitting his horse at her gate, looking at the Anchor W brand burned into the crossbar overhead the way a man looks at something he's turning over in his mind, and when she asked could she help him, he tipped his hat, said his horse had come up lame, and asked only whether she'd let him rest the animal in her corral overnight, and pay her for the trouble. A widow, alone with a foreclosure bearing down on her, had good reason to be careful of strange men on strange horses, and something in the width of his shoulders and the plain economy of the way he sat. A saddle told her this was not a man to be careless around. But there was nothing pressing in his manner, nothing that asked more than what he'd said he wanted, and the ranch hand's bunkhouse had stood empty since she'd let her last hired man go in July for want of wages to pay him. So she told the stranger he could put his horse up and that supper came with the arrangement, whether he liked it or not, because she was not the kind of woman who turned a tired traveler out to eat cold jerky within sight of her own kitchen fire. He gave his name as Gideon. No surname offered, none asked for, which was not so unusual in that country, where a man's past was considered his own business until he made it someone else's. He was maybe 35, dark-haired, going gray, at the temple, quiet in the particular way of men who have learned that most talk is wasted breath, and he moved around her yard that evening with an economy that struck her even then, before she understood what it meant, the way he checked the corral gate swing without being asked, the way he sat at her supper table, with his back to the wall and a clear line to the door, the way his eyes crossed the yard every few minutes the whole meal through, cataloging it, the way a man catalogs ground he might someday have to defend. She told him, because the silence at her table had grown long enough that filling it with her troubles seemed easier than sitting inside them alone. Something of the shape of her situation, the note, the banker, the inventory crew expected any day. She did not tell him everything, not that first night, because 11 months of grief and struggle had taught her not to hand her whole heart to a stranger over one supper. But she told him enough, and Gideon listened the way few men had listened to her since Thomas died, without once looking like he was waiting for his turn to talk. And when she finished, he only said that Sullivan Creed's name was not new to him, that he'd heard it spoken poorly in more than one town between here and the Panhandle, and that he'd be obliged if she'd let his horse finish healing before he moved on, because a lamed animal on that rocky ground north of town was no animal to be pushing. She said yes. She told herself it was only Christian decency toward a stranger's horse. She did not examine that first night why some part of her had felt, for the first time in 11 months, like the yard was a little safer with another set of eyes watching it. The 3 days that followed settled into a rhythm, neither of them named out loud. Gideon rose before she did, which she had not thought possible given how early she rose herself, and by the time she came out to the yard, he'd already mended the sagging gate hinge Thomas had meant to fix the summer he died, and moved a water trough that had been sitting in bad drainage since before Ada could remember. And done both without being asked, and without making a show of having done them. The way a man does chores he simply notices need doing, rather than chores performed to be seen. He asked about the herd's condition the second morning, plain ranching questions, how many head, how they'd wintered, whether the screwworm had been bad that year, and when Ada answered him plainly, the way Thomas used to let her answer, as though a woman capable of that kind of clear-eyed accounting was not a thing he'd expected to find alone on a struggling ranch, and was glad, in some quiet, unspoken way, to have been wrong about. They did not speak of Thomas directly, not yet, and they did not speak of whatever had put that particular stillness into Gideon's hands. But there was an ease growing between them regardless, the kind that grows between two people who have each separately learned to carry weight without asking anyone to notice, and who recognize that same weight in someone else almost before a word is spoken. Sullivan Creed's inventory crew arrived on a Thursday morning 4 days later, 3 men on good horses led by a man named Ezra Voss, who carried a deputy's badge from a county 3 days' ride distant that gave him no legal standing whatsoever. Voss was the kind of man banks like Creed's kept on retainer for exactly this work, not quite an outlaw, never quite crossing a line clean enough to hang him, but comfortable with a rifle in a way that made honest people move aside, and comfortable with reading a rich man's intentions a little more broadly than the man's actual instructions technically allowed, because a rich man paid better for enthusiasm than for restraint. Voss rode up to Ada's gate with his 2 men trailing and a printed inventory list from the bank in his coat, and it was there, at that gate, under the crossbar with the Anchor W brand burned into it, that he found Gideon already leaning against the fence post, having walked out from the bunkhouse the moment he heard riders on the road, the way a man does when he has spent a long time learning to notice riders before they notice him. Voss reined up short of the gate. This is bank business. Rancher's business, more like it belongs to whoever holds paper on this outfit, and that's Mr. Crad. You work here, or you just passing through? Passing through? Horse through a shoe. Then you can pass on through the gate and let us do our work." Voss swung down off his horse with the easy confidence of a man who has never once, in his life, had that confidence tested. He pulled the folded inventory list from his coat, loud enough for Ada to hear from the porch, and laid out Mr. Faxty, Griad's demand: a full count of cattle by brand, a survey of tack and equipment ahead of the filing, and, should the widow give him any trouble about it, his authority to note her as obstructing collateral inspection, authority he did not, in point of fact, have, since no court order accompanied that inventory list. Only Sullivan Creed's letterhead and Ezra Voss's own considerable talent for sounding official. It was here that Voss made the mistake that would matter later. More than anything else he did that week. He pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard, not aimed, not yet, but carried loose and visible the way a man carries a thing, specifically to be seen carrying it, and turned it into a warning. If her brand turned out not to match the collateral schedule filed with the bank, which happens sometimes with widows who didn't keep good books, the bank's position was that unmarked or mismarked stock could be seized outright as unsecured. Which meant, plainly enough for even a widow to understand, that he'd be well within his rights to run a hot iron over any animal whose brand raised a question, right there in the field, to settle the matter cleanly before the filing went through. It was a bluff built on nothing. No territorial law permitted a private inventory crew to rebrand a debtor's cattle on suspicion, and Ada, who had read every word of Thomas's note 3 times at that kitchen table, knew it was a bluff even as her stomach dropped at the thought of Thomas's own brand burned off his own cattle by a stranger's iron. But bluffs backed by a visible rifle carry a weight that has nothing to do with the law, and Ezra Voss knew that as well as Sullivan Creed did, which was precisely why Creed paid him what he paid him. Ada came down off the porch steps with her chin level and her voice steadier than her hands. "Touch that iron to one of my animals and you'll answer to the circuit judge for destruction of secured property." Voss, whatever badge you think that is pinned to your coat, Voss laughed, not unkindly, the particular laugh of a man who has heard brave words from frightened people before and found them reliably to soften. "Judge rides through twice a year, ma'am, and stays at Mr. Creed's hotel when he does. I wouldn't count that judge as your friend." He took a step toward the near pen, where perhaps 40 heads stood bunched against the far rail, rifle still loose in his hand, but his intention plain in the set of his shoulders, and that was the moment Gideon pushed off the fence post. 3 words, not loud, not needing to be, that would end up mattering more to Ezra Voss than any word spoken to him in years. "Put that down." Voss turned more amused than alarmed, because a saddle tramp with a lamed horse did not, on the face of it, look like a man whose opinion carried weight. "This ain't your business, Drifter." "Made it mine when you pointed a rifle at a woman on her own land." Gideon had not moved from where he stood, hands loose at his sides, and there was nothing in his posture that looked like a threat, which was, Ada would come to understand, exactly the thing that should have warned Ezra Voss, because men who mean to bluff usually posture, and men who do not need to bluff usually don't. Voss's own instincts, dulled by too many easy jobs, collecting on Sullivan Creed's paper against people too frightened or too honest to fight back, told him this was one more frightened rancher's hand. He raised the rifle, not quite level, more a gesture of authority than an actual aim, and he opened his mouth to say something about a drifter minding drifter's business, And he never finished the sentence, because in the time it took him to lift that barrel 3 inches, Gideon's hand had crossed to his own hip and back. And the rifle was in the dirt at Voss's feet, kicked clean out of his hands, and Voss himself was sitting down hard in the dust of Ada's yard, with no clear memory, afterward, of exactly how he'd gotten there, only that one moment he'd been standing with a rifle, and the next he was on the ground without one. And the drifter had not, as far as anyone could tell, even drawn his own gun to do it. The 2 men who'd ridden in with Voss sat their horses very still, hands well clear of anything, and Voss himself sat in the dirt looking up at Gideon with the particular dawning look of a man doing arithmetic. "Who in the hell are you?" Not really a question, more a statement of a fact he was only now beginning to grasp. "Nobody. You need to know." Gideon picked up the rifle, cleared it, and handed it back to Voss. But first, which was its own kind of message. "Tell Creed the widow's herd stays branded the way her husband branded it. Tell him if he sends men out here with rifles again, he can come himself next time and see how that goes." Voss and his men rode out inside the hour. Ada stood in her yard a long time after the dust settled, looking at the drifter who'd just disarmed an armed man with a motion so fast she genuinely could not describe afterward what she'd seen. A man whose horse needed a shoe. Gideon picked up the split rail Voss had knocked loose in his fall and set it back on the fence, and that was all the answer she got that day. Watered of what happened at the Anchor W gate reached Larkspur before supper, the way word always travels faster than a horse in a small county, and it reached Sullivan Cread's office above the bank in a version already exaggerated twice over by the time Ezra Voss himself limped in to deliver it in person. Cred listened to the account with his hands folded on his good desk and his face giving away nothing, because giving away nothing was the muscle he'd trained hardest in 9 years of building an empire out of other men's signatures. But inside that stillness, he was running a different calculation than Voss expected. Because Sullivan Cread had not gotten rich by ignoring information, and a nameless drifter who could put an armed man on the ground without appearing to draw a weapon was information of the most serious kind. He sent that night for a man named Whit Larrabee, a retired Army scout who did occasional work for the bank, identifying troublesome strangers, a man with a long memory for faces and a longer memory for the newspaper clippings and wanted bills that passed through his hands over 20 years on the frontier. Cread described the stranger as best Voss's account allowed: dark-haired, gray at the temple, a gray gelding, a draw too fast to see, and Larrabee sat with that description for the better part of 2 days before he came back to Cread's office with a name that made even Sullivan Cread's careful stillness crack, just slightly: Gideon Marsh Larrabee. Let the name sit a moment before he went on, the way a man lets a hand of cards sit face down while he decides how much to wager on it. You'll have heard it if you spent any time in the cattle counties north of here. Wells Fargo used him 3 years running to ride shotgun on payroll shipments nobody else would touch, because the road agents who tried him twice both ended up in a pine box, and word got around after that to leave the Wells Fargo payroll be. Before that, he wore a deputy marshal's star in 2 territories, cleaned out 3 separate gangs of rustlers who'd gotten too comfortable, and there's a story, can't swear to every word of it, that he called out 4 men outside a Cattletown saloon over a card dispute that wasn't even his, and walked away from all 4 without a scratch on him. He doesn't hire his gun out for money, not since Wells Fargo, from what I've heard. Rides where he pleases, gets involved where he decides it's worth getting involved, and men who've crossed him mostly don't get the chance to talk about it after. Cred absorbed this with the same face he wore reading a foreclosure filing, but the arithmetic underneath had changed entirely. A famous gunslinger loose on the Anchor W was not in itself a problem the law could solve. Gideon Marsh had broken no ordinance. Putting Voss in the dirt, and a bank's hired inventory crew getting embarrassed by a faster hand carried no legal weight against a mortgage note that remained, whatever else had happened. Perfectly valid and perfectly due on the 1st of October. But Creed understood, better than most men in his position, that the law was only one of the tools he owned, and that a man like Gideon Marsh, if he stayed, represented a threat to every other tool in the box. The marshal who did what Creed asked, the judge who stayed at Creed's hotel, the buyers and lawyers and clerks whose cooperation depended entirely on nobody in Larkspur County having the nerve to stand against the machine Creed had spent 9 years building. If word spread that a famous gunslinger had planted himself between Sullivan Creed and One Widow's Ranch, other debtors across the county might start remembering. They, too, had a right to say. Cred's answer to that threat was not at first to send more men with rifles. It was worse than that, and smarter than that. And it was the kind of answer only a man who owned a bank could reach for. He called in the note. 3 weeks remained before the 1st of October when the letter arrived at the Anchor W delivered by the bank's own clerk on a Tuesday morning, and it informed Ada Whitlock that in light of, quote, recent irregularities in the security of the collateral and apparent hostile interference with the bank's lawful inspection rights, the Larkspur County Trust was exercising its contractual right to accelerate the note in full effective immediately with foreclosure proceedings to commence in 7 days absent full payment of $4,000. 7 days, not 3 weeks. Credit found, buried in the same dense language that had trapped Thomas into a balloon payment he never understood, a clause permitting acceleration for interference with collateral inspection, and he had turned Gideon's rescue of Ada's herd into the very lever that would take the ranch from her faster than the original note ever intended. Ada read that letter at her kitchen table with Gideon standing in the doorway, having come in from checking the gray's heeled hoof, and she set the letter down, and for the first time since Thomas died, she let herself cry in front of another living soul, not from weakness, but from the particular exhaustion of watching every honest effort she made turned, again and again, into a weapon against her by a man who had never once had to raise his own voice or draw his own gun to destroy her. 7 days. There's no path to $4,000 in 7 days. Not honest, not any way. Gideon crossed the kitchen and sat across from her, and for the first time since he'd ridden onto her land, he offered something true about himself, not the whole of it, but enough. I've spent a long time watching men like Creed build their fortunes out of paper other people don't read close enough. Used to think the law would catch up to them eventually. Mostly it doesn't, because they write the law they hide behind. But paper's only as strong as the men willing to enforce it, and I've made something of a study over the years of showing men like that exactly how much their paper is worth once the men enforcing it lose their nerve. That's a threat, and Cred's not a man who scares. No, but Voss does. And Voss isn't the only man on Creed's payroll who does his enforcing. Every one of them scares a little more than Creed ever will, because every one of them's just hired help, and hired help remembers, eventually. A pause, long enough that the lamp between them guttered once and steadied. Give me the 7 days, not to raise $4,000, You're right, there's no honest path to that in a week. Give me the 7 days to find out exactly how much of what Cread's built actually belongs to him, free and clear, and how much of it is paper he's leaned on, the same way he leaned on your husband, sitting on other men's fear the way a bird sits an egg it never laid. Ada studied him a long moment across the lamplight, the stillness in his hands, the way he'd asked for time instead of promising a miracle, the plain fact that he had not once, in 3 days under her roof, made her feel like a debt he was collecting on his own account. 7 days, she said finally, and it was less a decision than a surrender to the only honest option left on the table. After that, there's nothing left of mine to give you time with. If you're new here and wondering whether Gideon really turns this around, whether one drifter with a fast hand actually unwinds 9 years of a banker's careful cruelty, stick with this one to the end, because what he found in that week is exactly the reason men like Sullivan Cread hope that nobody ever bothers to look closely at how their fortune was actually built. What Gideon found over the 5 days that followed, riding quietly to 4 ranches across the county and asking careful questions of men who'd long since stopped expecting anyone to ask, was a pattern so consistent it might as well have been a signature. Sullivan Cread's fortune was not built on 9 years of honest lending at all. It was built on a single repeated maneuver, refined and repeated on debtor after debtor across Larkspur County. Draw the note in language dense enough that a working rancher wouldn't catch the balloon clause, wait for a bad season or a death or a drought to make the balloon impossible to pay, then use the accumulated leverage of a bank charter, a captured land office, and a friendly circuit judge to strip the collateral down to nothing before the foreclosure ever reached open court, where an honest judge might actually read the note the way it was written, rather than the way Cread's clerks explained it. The Dunmore Ranch was Gideon's first stop, a half-day's ride south along the same Sweetwater Creek that fed the Anchor W, and he found there a family 3 years into a foreclosure fight of their own, ground down so slowly by legal costs and delayed filings that the Dunmore patriarch, a heavy-set man named Walter Dunmore, who'd known Thomas Whitlock well enough to stand at his funeral, had stopped mentioning the fight to his own neighbors, out of a shame that had nothing honest to be ashamed of and everything to do with how thoroughly isolated Cread's method left each family before it finished them. Dunmore did not trust the stranger at his gate at first, not until Gideon told him plainly that the widow Whitlock's water rights had been cut the same summer his own were challenged, on the same suspiciously convenient reading of the same new water law. Only made to feel that way, loosened Dunmore's tongue in a way 3 years of lawyers never had. From there, Gideon rode to a dry, hard-worked quarter section 2 days east, where he found a homesteader named Purcell, who'd lost 400 acres 2 years back, on a note with the identical balloon clause buried in the identical dense paragraph, a man now working as a hired hand on land his own grandfather had broken to the plow. Paid wages by the very outfit that had swallowed his birthright. Purcell talked for a long while that evening about the exact wording of the letter that had accelerated his own note, a phrase about interference with collateral inspection that matched, word for word, the phrase in the letter that had just landed on Ada's kitchen table. And by the time Gideon rode on the next morning, he had in his saddlebag 3 separate accounts, in 3 separate hands, describing what amounted to the same theft performed on 3 separate families who had, until that week, believed their ruin was theirs alone to carry. He found, most importantly, a clerk in the land office named Emmett Cray, a young man with a young family and a conscience that had been eating at him for the better part of a year, who had personally typed up the falsified water rights challenge, out of some instinct he couldn't fully explain even to himself. A carbon copy of the original filing before Creed's lawyer amended it. A carbon copy that showed, in black and white, that the water rights challenge had been drafted and dated 3 full weeks before Ada Whitlock ever set foot in Creed's office to ask for an extension, proving beyond any honest argument that Creed had planned to strip her collateral before he ever pretended to consider her request in good faith. Cray was terrified to hand that carbon over. He had a wife and a baby daughter, and a land office job that was the only thing standing between his family and the same ruin Cray had visited on half the county, and he told Gideon plainly that if Cray ever learned he'd talked, he'd lose that job inside a week and likely never work in the territory again. Gideon did not threaten him, did not pressure him, only sat with him on the porch of Cray's small house one evening and told him in the same plain voice he'd used to tell Ezra Voss to put down his rifle, that he had personally watched men who kept their conscience quiet for fear of what it cost them carry that silence for the rest of their lives, like a stone in their boot, and that he thought Emmett Cray did not strike him as a man built to carry that particular stone for 30 more years. Cray handed over the carbon copy the next morning, folded inside a Bible. He said he no longer entirely trusted himself to read straight through without it. With that single document and 4 other ranchers' sworn accounts of an identical pattern, Gideon rode back to the Anchor W on the 6th of the 7 days with something Sullivan Creed had never once had to reckon with in 9 years of quiet operation. That his foreclosures were not the ordinary business of a bank collecting a fair debt, but a documented pattern of premeditated fraud against half the ranching families in Larkspur County. The confrontation came on the morning the 7 days expired at the bank in Larkspur, in front of witnesses Creed had never expected to see gathered against him. Ada Whitlock at the front of them with Emmett Cray's carbon copy in her hand, and behind her the Dunmore family, and Purcell, the homesteader. And 2 more ranchers Gideon had spent his week finding, every one of them holding some piece of the same pattern, every one of them people, Sullivan Creed, had counted on staying too frightened, too isolated, too certain no one would believe a widow or a homesteader over a banker's word to ever stand in the same room together. Creed came down from his office with his composure fully intact, because composure was the last weapon a man like him had left once the paper turned against him, and he looked at the gathered ranchers, and at Gideon standing quiet at the back of the room, that he was a busy man, and did not appreciate being ambushed by a delegation of his own debtors. Ada's voice did not shake. She had spent a week watching Gideon Marsh face down armed men without raising his own voice, and something of that stillness had settled into her the way heat settles into stone. "You're not being ambushed, Mr. Creed. You're being shown the same courtesy you showed my husband. We read the fine print." She laid Cray's carbon copy on the counter, and the Dunmore patriarch laid his own family's original note beside it, and Purcell laid a copy of the foreclosure filing that had taken his grandfather's land. And one by one, the pattern assembled itself on that bank counter in a way that even Sullivan Creed's careful lawyers would struggle to explain away to a judge who actually read it. And Creed, for the first time in the telling of this story, said nothing at all for a long moment, doing arithmetic of his own. That carbon proves nothing a court would credit. Less certainty in it than Creed intended, and everyone in that room heard the crack running under it. Gideon spoke for the first time since he'd walked in, and every head in the room turned toward him, because word of what he'd done to Ezra Voss had reached every one of them by now, and there was a particular quality of attention a room gives a man once it knows what he's capable of, and has watched him choose so far. Maybe not on its own. But you've got 5 ranching families in this room, ready to testify to the same pattern, on the same terms, in front of a judge and a territorial newspaper that'll print every word of it whether that circuit judge wants it printed or not. I've spent time with newspapermen in 3 territories, Mr. Creed, same as I've spent time with rustlers and road agents and men who thought a badge or a bank charter put them above account. Every one of them learned eventually that reputation is the one collateral a man like you can't hide behind a fine print clause because it isn't recorded in any land office. It just spreads town to town. Same as word of what happened at that gate spread here inside a single afternoon. It was not in the end a gunfight that broke Sullivan Creed's grip on Larkspur County, though there had very nearly been one 3 nights before the confrontation at the bank. Gideon had not slept a full night since the 7 days began, precisely because he expected exactly this. A man like Creed, cornered by paper he could no longer control, did not simply fold, he lashed out once hard and quiet before he folded. Gideon heard the riders a half-mile off, 5 sets of hooves, moving too careful for honest travel at that hour, and he was already at the gate, unhurried, when Ezra Voss and 4 other men came out of the dark with instructions that were never written down anywhere a court could find them. The moon was thin that night, little more than a sliver over the ridgeline, and Ada watched from the darkened window of the house, forbidden by Gideon from coming out no matter what she heard, her hand pressed flat against the cold glass and her heart going harder than it had since the morning Thomas was thrown. She could make out shapes more than faces. 5 riders reining up short of the gate, one man's voice pitched low and hard, and Gideon standing exactly where he'd stood the day Voss first rode up, arms loose, hat tipped, not so much as a hand near his holster. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds, though Ada would swear afterward it felt like whole minutes stretched thin. Gideon's reputation had, by then, traveled far enough on its own that 4 of the 5 men Voss brought took one long look at who was waiting for them in the dark, and quietly, cornered now by his own pride as much as by Creed's money, unwilling to be the man who rode back to town, having backed down twice from the same drifter, he drew first. Gideon put a single bullet through the meat of his gun arm, clean and deliberate and nowhere near a kill, the shot cracking once across the dark range and echoing off the ridge before the night went quiet again. Voss went down to one knee in the dirt, more startled than hurt, clutching an arm that would heal whole inside a month, and Gideon crossed the ground between them without hurry and crouched beside him just long enough to say what needed saying. "Go home. Tell Creed the widow's gate holds tonight, and every night after. Tell him the next man he sends out here in the dark, I won't be half so careful where that bullet lands." Voss and the 4 riders were gone inside 10 minutes, and the anchored W stood quiet again under that thin moon, and Ada came out onto the porch to find Gideon already coiling a lead rope that hadn't needed coiling, hands steady, breath even. What actually broke Sullivan Creed was the newspaper. The territorial paper out of the county seat, tipped by a letter Gideon had sent a week earlier to an editor he'd known from his marshalling days, ran the story of the carbon copy and the 5 ranching families, 2 days after the confrontation at the bank, and within a week the circuit judge who had stayed so comfortably at Creed's hotel found it considerably less comfortable to keep ignoring sworn testimony from 5 separate families describing an identical pattern of fraud. Who had his own reputation to protect, and no particular loyalty to a small county banker once that banker became a liability rather than a convenience, opened a formal inquiry that would, over the following year, unwind Sullivan Crayhead's restoring land and water rights to families across Larkspur County who had given up hope of ever seeing it again, and would eventually see Creed himself stripped of his bank charter and run out of the territory entirely, though he was never in the end made to stand trial. The law that finally caught him was mostly the same law he'd always hidden behind, only this time turned around and pointed the other way. Ada Whitlock's own note, the $4,200 that had started all of it, was voided entirely inside that same inquiry. The balloon clause struck down as fraudulent inducement, her water rights restored in full, her grazing lease returned, and the anchor W stood that October and every October after. Exactly where Thomas Whitlock had built it, under exactly the brand he'd burned into that crossbar, with nobody's name on the mortgage at all anymore, because there was no mortgage left to hold. She asked Gideon to stay once the worst of it was over, and the gray gelding stood sound and healed in her corral with no more excuse left to keep him there. She asked him plainly, the way Thomas had taught her to ask hard questions on the porch. One evening with the last of that year's good grass turning gold in the last light, whether a man who had spent so long riding from one wrong to the next might ever consider riding toward something instead. A woman who no longer wanted to run 4,000 acres entirely alone. Gideon sat with that question a long while, long enough that Ada thought she already knew his answer before he gave it. When he finally spoke, he did not look away from her, which she would remember afterward as its own kind of honesty. There are men out there right now, living under the same paper your husband signed without reading close enough. Crad wasn't the only one who learned that trick, only the one I happened to ride past first. I've spent most of my life being the thing that shows up when the law's too slow or too bought to matter, and I don't know how to stop being that. Not yet, maybe not ever. If I stayed, Ada, I'd be staying as a man, still owing something to every ranch I haven't ridden to yet. That's not a no. It's not a no. It's just not a yes, I can give you honestly tonight. 3 days later, with the gray rested and reshod, he told her he would ride back through Larkspur County again someday, not as a passing stranger this time, but as a man with a reason already waiting for him. Ada Whitlock, who had learned more about honest men and dishonest paper in one autumn than most people learn in a lifetime, chose to believe him, because she had watched him keep every other quiet promise he'd made her since the morning his horse threw a shoe at her gate. The moral of it, if a story like this leaves one behind, is not that a fast gun beats a rich man's fortune, though it can, when the fortune is built on nothing sturdier than fine print and fear. It's that Sullivan Crayhead's whole empire depended, every single note of it, on people staying isolated in their own fear long enough to believe no one else was suffering the identical theft. And it took one man willing to ride quietly from ranch to ranch to show 5 separate families that their private shame was actually one shared crime, and that shared, it could be broken. Larkspur County was a different place the spring after, quieter in the way a place is quiet once a long-standing fear has finally lifted off it. The Dunmore family kept their water rights outright, filed clean and unchallengeable this time. Purcell got his grandfather's quarter section back inside the year, the accelerated note voided, alongside every other fraudulent instrument the banking commissioner's inquiry turned up. Emmett Cray kept his job at the land office, and more than that, kept a kind of quiet standing in the county that no clerk's salary could have bought him. the standing of a man who had risked everything he had to tell the truth when it mattered and found against his own worst fears. None of them ever saw Sullivan Creed again. He left the territory before the snow came, and what became of him after was never spoken of much in Larkspur County, because a place that had spent 9 years learning to fear one man's name found it did not much care to keep saying it once the fear was gone. Ada Whitlock kept the Anchor W, kept her husband's brand burned true into that crossbar, and kept, somewhere past the edge of that story, a quiet certainty that a debt honestly owed is one thing, and a debt engineered to be unpayable is another thing entirely, and that the difference between them is sometimes only visible to a stranger passing through who has spent his whole life learning to read the fine print other men hope you never will. If this one held you all the way to the end, tell me in the comments which part got you, the gate, the carbon copy, or the porch at the end. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so the next one finds you the moment it's out. There are more towns like Larkspur County out there, more quiet men like Gideon riding through them, and more stories worth staying for.